Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Turok, Dinosaur Hunter, originally for Nintendo 64 but later released on PC. What you're seeing here is the remastered version that was released in 2015 and done by Night Dive Studios. This is a first-person shooter developed by Iguana Entertainment and published by Acclaim Entertainment back in 1997 for Nintendo 64 and later released on PC the same year. And at the time, it was very well received, which is pretty surprising given that it was originally a Nintendo 64 first-person shooter, and first-person shooters really don't work very well on that console. But that's more of a hindsight kind of thing. We know now that a dual analog sticks is infinitely better than a single analog stick for controlling an FPS on a console. But even with the limitations of the console in mind, it went on to get quite a lot of praise, and it is still looked back on very favorably in hindsight. But here's the question. Does the game itself actually hold up, or is the fond remembrance only nostalgia? Well, I have to preface this review by saying I didn't play the original Turok back in the day. I have no nostalgia for it. And with that in mind, let's go ahead and delve into this thing and find out how it is. Well, as far as presentation goes, obviously it is extremely dated. This was a Nintendo 64 game released in 1997. It is gonna look old. And in that regard, it has rather blocky models. The textures are very, very low res, even though they are actually surprisingly detailed. Animations are very simplistic, the lighting engine is not particularly great, although you have to keep in mind what you're seeing here is the remastered version. The original release was less detailed than this. And the one big change over the original release is the draw distance. In the original N64 and PC versions of this game, the draw distance was extremely short. And there's a very good reason for that. The N64 simply wasn't capable of rendering a much further distance than that. It already had really severe frame rate drops when a bunch of enemies were on screen to begin with, and when you throw in the fact that the environments in this game are generally pretty huge, well, that's a recipe for really terrible frame rates. In fact, I think some of that is just the engine itself, because even on my modern hardware, the remastered version has some frame rate drops on occasion. It's also worth noting that it doesn't seem to handle the FOV settings very well. The original game ran at a really low FOV, and since that makes me nauseous and gives me headaches, I decided to go ahead and up the FOV to what I normally play at, which is about 100 degrees. Like a lot of early 3D FPSs, this caused a bit of a fisheye effect, and if that bothers you, then, well, too bad. I would much rather not have headaches and nausea, and I would actually like to be able to see what I'm doing, thank you very much. And that's something that's pretty important because there's a lot of platforming in this, so being able to see what you're doing is a major bonus. And on the default FOV, it is definitely a bit tricky to mess around with the platforming. But anyway, I'm digressing from my main points about the visuals, which ultimately boil down to, it's definitely very dated, but if you take into consideration what system it was on and when it came out, it's actually surprisingly visually impressive. What's less impressive is the sound design, where you have very limited voice acting, which basically consists of and not very much more than that. Dialogue's really not a thing in this game, so what little voice acting there is incredibly cheesy and mostly just a bunch of grunting, yelling, and screaming. The sound effects are fairly lo-fi, and they're not particularly great either. Explosions aren't very beefy, gunfire's not all that beefy, it's just kind of a letdown in that department. And then you move over into music, which is fairly simplistic and mostly consists of a lot of drums. It's certainly not a terrible soundtrack, it's just that it's not at all memorable, and you really just kind of get annoyed by it after a while. And while it is admittedly a lot more due to the game design than the sound design, the music still is pretty weak. So there was plenty of room for improvement there, and it was ultimately a bit disappointing in that regard. But of course what really matter here are the story, or rather mostly lack thereof, and the gameplay. And the story in this is mostly just setup. You play as Talset, a Native American warrior who has the title of Turok, and his whole objective is to prevent the campaigner from getting the Chrono Scepter. You see, the Chrono Scepter is an extremely powerful weapon that was split into a bunch of different parts and scattered throughout the Lost Lands in order to prevent it from falling into the wrong hands. And those wrong hands belong to the campaigner, who is an evil overlord who wants to rule the universe by ripping time apart, effectively. So the game consists of you tracking down all of the pieces of the Chrono Scepter and then confronting and defeating the campaigner. That's really it. There's not much story to this game at all. And the thing is, it's during that transitionary period between when first-person shooters basically had no story at all and when they started to become more story-heavy. So here you get enough for the setup, but then the rest of the game is just kind of an arcade-style run-and-gun shooter. You run around, you blast the living crap out of anything in your way with a pretty decent arsenal. A lot of it's fairly basic stuff by modern standards, or even standards of the day, really, but they are surprisingly satisfying to use. And some of that's due to the fact that there are different ammo types that you can pick up in order to do different things. For example, you can get tech arrows, which upgrade your arrows from being simple arrows to explosive arrows. Or you can get explosive rounds for your shotguns, which make things a bit more interesting as well. And when you throw that into the mix, you find that even though a lot of the weapons are very basic, and in particular with things like the shotgun, which gets outright replaced by the auto shotgun, or the pistol, which gets outright replaced by the assault rifle, well, you've got a pretty decent arsenal on your hands. The issue is that the game barely gives you enough ammo to really get much use out of that arsenal, and unless you find a backpack, you're limited to an extremely small amount of ammunition. I mean, to give you a prime example, shotgun shell capacity is 20 rounds when you don't have a backpack. If you do have a backpack, it's 40 rounds. And even that you're going to burn through pretty quickly, which can get pretty frustrating. And frustration leads me to my next point, which is the actual level design. You see, for all the solid weapon handling, you're tasked with going through environments that are often a pain to navigate because they're huge and a lot of them are very confusing. While it's fairly easy to navigate the first two worlds, once you get further into the game and you start getting into things like the catacombs, then things get a lot messier because now you end up with a lot of paths that snake around the levels and go back in on themselves, and it ends up just being a mess. I mean, to give you a prime example, I can't even tell you the number of times I got lost going around the crypt and going, wait a minute, what the hell did I miss? Where am I going? What am I doing? And that sort of thing gets very frustrating, especially when you consider the amount of backtracking you have to do in this game. You see, not only is it given a sort of non-linear design as far as which levels you can access at any given time goes, the keys for the various levels are scattered all over the place. So you might find 2 keys for, say, level 4 on level 2, but then you go to level 3 and that's where the last key for level 4 is. It's a mess. And by far, that is actually the worst aspect of the game. Having to go combing the entirety of the level because you missed one key way back when, or you missed the part of the Chrono Scepter, or something along those lines ends up just getting infuriating because you're basically not allowed to progress until you've scoured the entirety of the level and found everything in it. And while you do have that non-linear nature for the first 2 levels, once you get past that, there's a fairly obvious progression from there. So they don't really fully commit to the non-linear level design, and it ends up coming across as a bit confused, on top of the levels themselves often getting confusing. Something else that's confusing is why there is such a heavy emphasis on platforming on a game that was originally released for N64 and is a first-person shooter. The control scheme on an N64 just does not work very well for first-person platforming, and yet they did it anyway, and they did it in droves, with a lot of really precise jumps being needed. That's tricky enough with a keyboard and mouse, but with an N64 controller, it's just a nightmare. Now, admittedly, that's more of a hindsight is 2020 kind of thing, but it still ends up being something of a problem, particularly for people who are playing it on N64, where platforming is generally a lot more difficult. And speaking of N64, this really does speak to the fact that this was one of those transitionary games between the old school arcade first-person shooters and the newer school of first-person shooters that really kicked off in full with something like Half-Life. Of course, like any old school first-person shooter, you're going to have health and armor pickups, although the armor actually replaces your health meter until it depletes, which is kind of interesting. But on top of that, you have a point system, where you can collect a bunch of points, and those show up as the triangles up at the top right of the screen, and those actually will give you an extra life once you hit 100 of them. You see, whenever you die in Turok, it's not a game over, it just puts you at the last checkpoint that you passed and deducts one of your lives. The problem with that is that the game is rather stingy on the checkpoints, particularly once you get later on into the game. This means that you could backtrack for considerable amounts of time just because you happen to fall into a pit. Now, I understand that this is a console shooter, and particularly for N64, they had much stricter memory requirements than you would on, say, PC, but a save anywhere option would have been really nice. Instead, we have this weird hybrid system where you have the various checkpoints, but there are also save points that you can specifically go up to and save in a slot. And a checkpoint only activates once, so you're actually going to be making pretty good use of those save points because you can save as many times as you want as long as you're at a save point. Of course, when you combine that with the amount of backtracking that's in this game, that actually can get more frustrating than anything else because you're constantly going, wait a minute, where am I going? Where's the checkpoint? Oh crap, I ran out of checkpoints. I must have gone to the end of the level. Well crap, now I guess I have to scour the entire level all over again because I missed something somewhere. And while a checkpoint system is frustrating to begin with, if there's a lot of backtracking involved, that makes it just so much worse. But then they round things out by giving you a couple of boss battles throughout the course of the game, and they're not the best boss battles ever. They're kind of bland and uninteresting from a gameplay standpoint. But then again, there aren't all that many games that have you do a boss battle against a frickin' T-Rex. And let's face it, that counts for a lot. But when you bring everything together, what you end up with is a first-person shooter that was definitely a product of its time. We really hadn't figured out 3D first-person shooters in their entirety by 1997. We were getting there, but we weren't quite there yet. And when you throw it being a console game into the mix, that's where things get even dicier because, let's face it, we didn't figure out console first-person shooters until the early 2000s. And on Nintendo 64, that was almost impossible due to the simple fact that there was only one analog stick. So you made do with what you had on that system. It was at an objective disadvantage compared to something like, say, the PlayStation, which eventually released with the DualShock that had 2 analog sticks. And of course, when you port it over to PC, you mitigate the control issues, but even still, the game design is just not quite there. While occasionally it does work fairly well and it is fairly enjoyable at those points, there's just so much frustration to be had from going back and scouring the entire level for something you missed, or something you thought you missed, only you find out you didn't miss it. And while the shooting mechanics are certainly solid for their time, they just aren't enough to overcome the level design's problems. The backtracking just starts to get excessive, and then the platforming makes things even worse. So when you go back and you play the original Turok, even if it is this remastered version that has enhanced visuals and controls, you find that it's really just not that great of a first-person shooter. It's not awful or anything, it's just a product of its time. They hadn't quite figured out everything yet, and really the only reason you'd want to go back to it is either the historical value or nostalgia. Other than that, the only people I can actually recommend this game to are old-school first-person shooter enthusiasts who are willing to put up with the large amount of issues that the level design and the platforming have. If you can do that, then you might be able to enjoy Turok Dinosaur Hunter. But even then, it's a bit difficult to recommend this one outright because of one simple fact that would render this one completely obsolete. But you know what? I'm going to save that for another video. But if you are interested in actually playing Turok, then I will have links in the video description box where you can pick this up on Steam or GOG. Thanks for watching.